All right, we're going to get started. I'm Pete Peterson, the very grateful Dean of Pepperdine's Graduate School of Public Policy, and it's a delight to welcome you here to this important conversation at the intersection of history, public policy, and government. We are delighted to partner for this event with the Office of Community Belonging, led so ably by Dr. Jay Gooseby Smith, who'll be up here in a second, as well as Pepperdine Libraries under the guidance of Dean Rusa and Jeff. It's been great partnering with you on this effort. Before we get underway, I have to extend special thanks to my dear friend, Dr. Stuart Davenport, whose idea it was to reach out to Connor about this event. In so many ways, this broader conversation represents much of what we hold dear at the School of Public Policy, which is this unique view of making policy today grounded in an understanding of history, or what we would call thinking historically about public policy. The work I do specifically, aside from being Dean of the Policy School, is to lead something called the Davenport Institute for Public Engagement, and through that work I get a chance to train local government officials in how to engage residents in making policy decisions at the local level. And it just never ceases to amaze me as I'm consulting with cities in this work that even the most current decisions, even the most recent and front page headline policy decisions that we see at the local level, whether it's in something to do with public safety or recent decisions around COVID response, so many of these harken back to earlier perceptions of governing institutions that are grounded in history, things that happened 30, 40, 50, 70 years ago. For the residents of those communities, it might as well have happened yesterday. And so what we call this thinking historically approach to public policy is so important. I thought to get into that topic, or this topic in a way, I wanted to quote from a friend of mine, another historian who's taught with us as a visiting professor, Dr. Bill McClay, who wrote a piece recently in a blog called Law and Liberty about the difference between history and memory. Because as you see here in the title of this discussion, there's a difference between history and memory. And for many people, especially in the areas that involve public policy decisions or government decisions, it's not so much our understanding of history as it may have been, but how we remember it that's so important for all the good and bad of it. I wanted to quote just one paragraph from this piece that Dr. McClay wrote specifically on history and memory. Quote, "Of course, the study of history is not all sweetness and light. It can be sobering and shocking and morally troubling. James Baldwin even called history, quote, the nightmare from which no one can awaken, because, quote, people are trapped in history and history is trapped in them, unquote. One does not have to believe in original sin to study it successfully, but it probably helps. By relentlessly placing on display the pervasive crookedness of humanity's timber, history brings us back to earth, equips us to resist the powerful lure of radical expectations, and reminds us of the grimmer possibilities of human nature. Possibilities that for most people living in most times have been the least bit imaginary. With such realizations firmly in hand, we are far better equipped to move forward in the right way." How do we understand history and yet move forward in the right way? To me, that is really a way of capturing this important conversation. So again, we are delighted at the Policy School to partner with our friends at the Office of Community for Community Belonging. And so let me welcome up their leader, Dr. Jay Gooseby Smith, who will introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Dean Peterson, for this opportunity to partner with you. Many people are probably saying, why in the world would the Office for Community Belonging be partnering on this topic? Well, one of the things that we so value is partnering with our schools and departments. And so this was an opportunity to partner with public policy on a very important topic because this has to do with the community and looking at the renaming of different facilities. Also, it's an opportunity to partner with the brilliant minds such as Dr. Stuart Davenport of Seaver College. And all of us are interested in so many topics. Also, like Dean Peterson, I hold another role, which is director of the Larry D. Kimmons Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation Initiative. It's based upon the national initiative by the same name, and 5 of the pillars that it's based upon, 2 of those pillars are racial healing and narrative change. And when you're looking at changing the names of different bases, that's narrative change. And you look at some of the reasons for doing that, that's racial healing. So thank you so much for the opportunity to partner in this. And I look forward to a wonderful discussion. So let me introduce the speaker. I'm going to tell you some of his bona fides, but the thing that excited me the most in his bio is that it says, ever since a family friend gave him a book of pictures and poems about presidents at age 4, Connor Williams has been interested in American history. And I think it was just the most exciting thing to me to think about how at our Christian university we talk about calling, and the seeds of those callings and the things that really just interest you from the beginning are things to not ignore. And so it's nice to see that you're still doing that. Anyway, for the serious stuff. So, Connor Williams is the lead historian for the Congressional Naming Commission, researching the history, causes, and context of Department of Defense assets that commemorate Confederates or the Confederacy. He directs the Commission's historical initiatives, collaborates with other historians involved and invested in the Commission's work, and engages with both the general public and specific stakeholders. Connor advises the Commission through historical briefings and assists in the research and presentation of potential new namesakes to the naming commissioners. This work culminates with Connor's contributions to the Naming Commission's final report to Congress. Honored by this opportunity for national service, Connor has taken a leave of absence from Yale University, where he works in the departments of History and African American Studies, and is in the final stages of completing his doctorate. So he's the soon-to-be Dr. Williams. Prior to Yale, Connor completed an MA in Globalization Studies at Dartmouth College, where he wrote a thesis on diasporic influences upon Frederick Douglass's political thinking. As a historian, Connor broadly studies 19th century America with a focus on racial politics and racial identity in the 50 years following the Civil War. He is currently revising articles on 19th century historiography and was a finalist for the 2016 Louis Pelzer Memorial Award given by the Organization of American Historians to the best article by a graduate student. Connor has taught at Yale University, Southern Connecticut State University, and for the Yale College Writing Center. He has also worked for Yale's Manuscripts and Archives Division and the Gilder Lehrman Center for the Study of Slavery, Resistance, and Abolition. And interviewing him will be Stuart Davenport, our very own resident professor of history. So I will hand this mic to you, Stuart. Oh, you're going to come next? Okay, great. Here's a lapel.
Well, good afternoon. Thank you so much for Dr. Smith for the introduction, Dean Peterson for organizing the event, Dr. Davenport for the questions, and thank you all to you for being here. I do understand I'm competing with Dwight from The Office right now. I do want to say my grandfather, who's a supporting character in this work, had a camp in the mountains above Scranton. So I've grown up as a summer Scrantonian for the last 35 years. So any questions you have about Scranton, I'm happy to explain. I do also want to talk today briefly about, I'm grateful for the introduction, because history, memory, and commemoration. If there are 3 words you could keep with you after this, it's history, memory, and commemoration, because they're very often conflated in our society, but they often mean very different things. One Pepperdine memory that I have, I just have to explain this, it's really cool to be here. When I was 14, I was watching Pepperdine in the NCAA tournament. And they had a point guard who I've long since forgotten, who was just draining three after three after three. And they upset, I think it was Indiana. But that memory in my mind is ingrained deep in me. And I still want to go out to like a basketball court and try and shoot a three, because I think it'll just go in here. But the point of that is that I was looking that up. I said, that must have been like the Elite Eight or something. And it turned out it was a first round game. But for some reason, my memory made that such an important part of my development, even though history tells me something very otherwise. And that's a theme to kind of think with here. Anytime that you talk about changing monuments to the past, 4 questions come up. And they're very good questions. And I'll address them each, I hope, in this presentation. The first is just, what about all the good things these people did? Didn't Robert E. Lee's decision to fully surrender Appomattox, to resist guerrilla warfare, to resist commentating on the post-war society, wasn't that a boon in bringing the United States back together? Didn't he serve the country for 30 years before the Civil War? Weren't all Americans racist? It is not difficult to find Abraham Lincoln or any other icon saying pretty horrible things by today's standards about people of color, Native Americans, in some cases women. How can you judge somebody for the culture they grew up in? I have kids, and at some point, I'm going to have to talk to them about the carbon emissions I and my culture did that's heating the planet they're going to inherit. And so I didn't know any better in 1998. We still are learning these things. But how do you want to judge somebody for the culture they grew up in? I guarantee you things that we think are great now will be seen as offensive or problematic in the future. That's been the case for millennia now. And lastly, excuse me, isn't this erasing history? I don't like the Confederates. And here I'm putting on the voice of somebody. I don't approve of them, what they did. I think enslavement was horrible. I'm so glad the United States won the Civil War. But it happened. And so if you take these monuments down, aren't you erasing history? Isn't that a really slippery slope? And these questions, I had the hurricane motif up there because you can start anywhere on this chain, and they tend to spin around and around in the warm waters of our fertile minds. And then they come out with all kinds of anger, fear, which in some cases is very human. This goes back more than 2,000 years. Veneration of the past is in all of our societies. Cicero, who himself was killed in the Civil War the year before he died, wrote that the life of the dead consists in the memory cherished of them by the living. So as long as somebody is cherished in our memories, they're not truly gone. That's also the main conceit to the Walt Disney movie Coco. And the reason I point that out is because anytime you have Marcus Tullius Cicero and Walter Disney on the same page, you've got a real human phenomenon that's been going on for millennia. And that's something we have to think about. We're going through a time right now where the memories we have and the monuments to them are being reconsidered, especially for the American Civil War. This is largely, I'd say, an East Coast phenomenon, though there are pockets of it throughout the country. But when they took the Lee statue from Lee Circle in New Orleans with a crane, when protesters reinterpreted, some have said, the Robert E. Lee monument in Richmond, people point out that Stonewall Jackson on Monument Ave, this is the capital of the Confederacy, where there used to be 4 major statues to icons of the Confederates. Without his equestrian statue there, it looks like a mausoleum for him. And at the bottom, the United Arts of the Confederacy, the chief pro-Confederate memory group, their offices were firebombed. And their giant doors, once a symbol of pride and power, are now shuttered, essentially, trying to keep out the public. So we're going through this time. These were inspired. History happens like this. This was inspired largely over the protests in the summer of 2020, over the death in police custody of George Floyd and others. And you can't fully tie a connection that I know of between George Floyd's death in Minneapolis and the actions of the Confederacy. But oftentimes in American history, when some injustice is shown, people focus on things they can do right away. And it's going to take a very long time in our country to improve police-community relations. It's going to take a lot of time to think about housing policy and equity. But many Americans from all political classes started saying, why do we still have monuments up to people who, and here's the thing about the Confederates, however you feel about states' rights, secession, fighting for your home, Confederates fought and killed United States Army soldiers. They didn't fight and kill Union soldiers or Federals or Yanks. They fought and killed United States Army soldiers. If you served in the United States Army in the Civil War, it said USA on your belt buckle. You're in the same army that George Washington founded, that Colin Powell served in, that continues today. The Confederate Army had no antecedent or descendant. So that movement translated, this is the public policy part, into an effort that started in the Senate to change any Department of Defense asset that had a commemoration of the Confederacy. And they did this in an interesting way. They did it through the 2021 NDAA, National Defense Authorization Act. Everything in Washington has an acronym, but this is what it does. And the NDAA is the single largest bill our government passes on an annual basis. It funds the military for the entire next year. Most recently, there was some prominence, because the most recent one they did, the military asked for $800 billion, and they gave them $840 billion. They essentially said, we're looking at China and Russia and Ukraine, and there's a lot of scary things out there. Here's $40 billion extra. Please be extra prepared for the future. This is how Congress sets military policy. So the provision that they did was in Section 370. And that matters, because if it's Section 370, there are 369 sections before us. And those contained things like better parental leave fix for all soldiers, paying civilians who are in combat zones more money, anti-discrimination acts, things that everyone was behind. And there's no line item veto, so President Trump vetoed the entire act. The commission created was to identify any Department of Defense name, symbol, monument, display, or paraphernalia. So paraphernalia, if it's a cocktail napkin or a street sign, it's gotta go, that commemorated the Confederates or the Confederacy and make a plan for its removal or modification. So one key thing, we didn't have the choice of whether it could stay or go. Congress said if it commemorates a Confederate, it has to be changed. When President Trump vetoed this, some of you have been reading, I could see the tweets. The most important one, I think, is the last one. He said, our history as the greatest nation in the world will not be tampered with. Respect our military. And the history as the greatest nation in the world. I mean, I'm a historian. You could talk about the Roman Empire circa 180 AD or Ming China. There are lots of pretty impressive nations, empires in the past. So I'm not sure of the history, but the memory of America as the greatest nation in the world, that matters to a lot of us. American exceptionalism is a real thing, and so that's something that I think matters a lot. When President Trump vetoed this, it set up a showdown, essentially, and here timelines really matter. On December 23rd, 2020, President Trump vetoed the act. During the Christmas holidays, normally a very quiet news time, everybody weighed in, even the Heritage Foundation, which is far from a liberal left-wing organization. They said, why did he do this? We need to fund our military. This is not the time to fight over these names. And then on January 1st, the Senate overrode Trump's veto for the only time of his presidency. And the numbers matter. It was 81 overriding the veto, 13 against the override, and 6 abstentions. And in those 13 was Bernie Sanders. So voting against or voting to keep the veto was not necessarily a sign of being a far conservative. It was having an ideological issue. Also important because contingency matters in history. We have to remember what happens first and then second. So the Naming Commission was created and endorsed and overridden before the insurrection happened. So we are not a reaction to the insurrection or the Capitol events, but we are very much kind of informed by that. So we were already created before that happened. But the choices of some people to carry certain flags and imagery in that day brought the idea of the Confederacy to the fore in a whole new way that is we can talk about in the questions and answers maybe. Also worth knowing, John Calhoun, the architect of secession, has his portrait right here, so it's an interesting kind of juxtaposition. So this created the Naming Commission, and this has been the honor of my career to work for these 8 men and women. They, between the 8 of them, I mean this very well, have well over 200 years of experience in Washington politics, in military leadership, in defense military relations, defense civilian relations. We had the first woman ever appointed 4-star admiral in the Navy, whose job before this was command of the entire Mediterranean fleet. We had the former West Point History Department chair. We had the commandant of the Marine Corps, the head of the draft, the head of the Army Corps of Engineers, John McCain's campaign advisor, a sitting congressman from Georgia. These were incredible civil servants and military officials who have benefited from so many years of expertise. And our job, to very briefly outline this, essentially I've tried to have the words next to the picture, if that makes sense, but I'll explain how this slide works. So essentially, we were created by Congress. We worked for them. They mandated our work. They gave us our charge. They gave us 2 years to do this work. They said, go out and report back to us in 2 years. We chose to report back a lot more often than that, but that was who we worked for. And so we reported to Congress. But because we were doing military installations and military ships, and the lion's share were in the Army, the military supported us. There were 6 people who worked for the Naming Commission direct support staff, like myself. We had a lawyer, a public affairs person, a planner, a legislative affairs person, and an archivist. But there were well over 50 Army officers who supported us in our work. We had a 2-star general, a major general, whose entire job was to essentially make sure that the military and the Naming Commission worked well together. In response, we heard the thoughts of the military a lot. We went to all 9 of the bases we're going to be renaming, and we heard their thoughts. We spoke to civilians. I'll talk more about that in a little bit. But we had no obligation to follow their orders. This is a thought experiment, but if Mark Milley had emailed me, or even our chair, the admiral, and said, I want you to do this, we could have respectfully said, I'm sorry, we don't work for you. We have no reason to follow what you want us to do. It did not happen, but that's the way the organization worked. But they supported our mission. It's an incredibly humbling experience to have a colonel who's flown combat helicopters in Iraq calling me to make sure I'm going to be okay to make a meeting or something. I was so impressed by the military men and women who I worked with in the Naming Commission. And the last thing just worth pointing out is that the Congress funds the military and the military serves the American people. That is not by accident. That's because George Washington returned his commission in 1783, and that really matters because not every nation has a military under civilian control. So I just wanted to point that out. So over the course of 18 months, Naming Commission went to every installation throughout the South. We met with thousands of Americans. We read tens of thousands of emails. This is a photo of myself and Major General Timothy Williams of the Virginia National Guard. We're at the Virginia War Memorial talking about how Confederate memory may or may not play in the National Guard. It looks like we're fighting there. We're not. We're having a really good conversation, but it's a photo that kind of captures the Naming Commission's civil-military relations. We briefed Congress. The chair and vice chair briefed Congress at least once a month, sometimes more. We went to Capitol Hill twice and briefed the whole House Armed Services Committee, Senate Armed Services Committee staff, the HASC and the SASC. Everything has an acronym in DC. And we wrote 3 reports to Congress that outlined our plans for what amounted to, can't make this up, 1,111 lines of Excel spreadsheet of Confederate commemorations. I got to that point and I was like, let's go for either 2222 or keep it. It's such a good, but and we talk more about what's being commemorated. And ultimately what I really focused on, and I should acknowledge that the next slide contains some images of amputations and some evidence of what happens when wars are fought. But we really focused on history, memory, and commemoration. And that was our charge because, again, our charge was not to say, should Robert E. Lee be commemorated? Congress, by 81 votes in the Senate and a similar majority in the House, said he should not be. But our job is to say why, essentially. Oftentimes, Congress essentially will make an act, because they're very busy people, and they'll say, go out and do this, and oh, by the way, tell us kind of why it's important. And so as we were thinking about this, I read lots of philosophy of memory, lots of philosophy of history, spoke with lots of historical colleagues, and I really came up with this. I'll read from the report in a moment, but our nation's memory of the Civil War is vast. In many ways, we want to think that all of American history starts in the Civil War, goes through it. That's true in some aspects. But every year, Americans, we love our Civil War in a way that other nations don't. These are reenactors. I hope you all get a chance to go to Barcelona at some point in your life. It is beautiful. But you will never see on a Sunday morning in Barcelona nationalists and fascists getting out a fake machine gun to recreate the trenches there. But Americans every year go to Gettysburg and other battlefields to reenact our Civil War. And I really appreciate reenactors. They're my allies, so I'm not trying to start any fights with them. But I always tell them that if you want to really reenact the Civil War, you have to lose at least 7 years of education, all your vaccinations, all of your shoes, eat 800 calories a day, and that 800 calories is essentially hardtack and salt pork, march about 20 miles a day in some cases, sleep out under the weather, and then you're getting close to the American Civil War. So Americans want a Civil War that they can appreciate as long as they can take pictures of it, sit in a lawn chair, use a portola instead of an open-air latrine, have an ambulance on site to help out anybody who gets too hot. And the reality of the American Civil War is much, much grimmer. It is far and away the deadliest conflict in our nation's history. It killed more Americans between those fighting for the United States and those fighting against them than all of our other wars combined. So Revolution, 1812, Mexican-American War, Spanish-American War, World War I, World War II, Korea, Vietnam, Gulf Storm, Desert Storm, and the global war on terror, all of those, and then the American Civil War. On a per capita basis, it was 10 times deadlier than World War II. 40% of all United States soldiers were buried in unmarked graves. 60% of all USCT troops were buried in unmarked graves. On a per capita basis in the American Civil War, there were 46 days deadlier than 9/11. And this was all done because about 5.5 million Americans, and I can talk about that number later, attempted to start a new nation grounded in enslavement, and who even they, by their actions, agreed had committed treason. So the question was, why are we commemorating these men, all men, most prominently on 9 military bases? And we can speak more about them, but it's important to note that John Brown Gordon not only was an effective Civil War general, he also founded the Ku Klux Klan in Georgia, and he threatened African Americans with a genocide if they didn't submit after the war was over. Henry Benning was a secessionist convention. He fought as hard as he could to get more states out of the United States. George Pickett was a war criminal. He had 20 US soldiers hung. And the list goes on. And so the Naming Commission's job was to find all the reasons why the men and women on the right were more appropriate for commemoration than the men on the left. I do want to briefly talk about history and memory, because our history and memory of the war needs some reconsidering. Most importantly, this is the National Geographic map of this American Civil War. As you can see, there's the gray, there are the border states, there's the North, and it looks very daunting. One of the things we often talk about as a great lecture point in the American Civil War is that the United States had to occupy and conquer, in a sense, an area the size of continental Europe. But this is also our memory versus history, because our memory of Texas and Florida tend to be as the political powerhouses they are today, and of these states as being very large. Georgia is the size of New York. One thing we tend to forget is how much of the Confederacy was truly enslaved. This is a map from 1861. Is the darker areas are areas where 70 to 90% of the population is enslaved. So that means out of the 40 of us in this room, there would be 4 of us who are free and 36 of us enslaved. And not surprisingly, the places that secession is really driven by are these dark areas. Jefferson Davis is from the Mississippi River, Howell Cobb from Georgia. Also important to note that if you read this map, words really matter. This is 1861. Note, it's not sold for the benefit of the sick and wounded soldiers of the Federals or the Yankees. It's for the United States Army. And it's not the Confederacy, it's the southern states of the United States. And Lincoln was very clear on this. Confederates cannot secede. When Confederates seceded, they did not take the 2 chairs from Mississippi out of the Senate and say, well, they're out of the Union. He never acknowledged secession. What this means is if you plug this in and take away the enslaved population, and this is kind of problematic, so you had to take away the enslaved population, who were forced to be used as war labor. But you get a civil war that looks something really like this. And no offense to California, but California is not very populated yet. But we forget that New York and Pennsylvania had more free people in it than the entire Confederacy. That 3 United States cities had more free people in them than 6 Confederate states combined. That the original Confederacy of just the 7 states, the Deep South, had fewer people in it, free people, than just Pennsylvania alone. And if you think about, as the war goes on, by 1863, this is essentially the idea. You can see just New York is the size virtually of all the Confederates. And so this ultimately, to me, makes us rethink the idea of the Civil War as having half our history. We can't erase half our history. This is not, to my mind, half our history, and it never was. Ultimately, when I had to write about this, and I am somewhat proud of our reports. I've heard from many government officials that they go above and beyond the usual government report. But I ultimately settled on this explanation. Although Americans owe much of their modern identity to the Civil War, they do not owe equal commemoration to both sides. Though often conflated, commemoration and history come from all sections of our society and serve different purposes for different people. Your memory and my memory may very well be different, but history is something we have to all reckon with. History describes the people and places of the past in all their greatness and grimness, achievements and failures, nobility and notoriety. It's complicated. Commemoration elevates an act, event, or individual by bestowing it with communal esteem and honor. The best histories present humans and their choices in the context of the complex and complicated days they lived through, articulating those decisions and actions to inform us in the societies of our past. People are complicated. Their decisions are complicated. We need everything we can to study Lincoln's decision processes or Robert E. Lee's thought processes as he decided whether to leave the United States and fight against them or stay. But the best commemorations highlight individuals, movements, and moments that epitomize the highest values of our present and motivate us as we shape our societies of the future. History recounts, explains, and examines. Commemoration celebrates, affirms, and extols. History is about who we were, but commemoration is about who we strive to be. And I think ultimately that's why I'm okay as a historian with these monuments coming down. I dare say there's been a book a day written about the Civil War since it ended. On average, every day since the war ended, there's been another book written. I'm in the process of writing another book about the Civil War, so I'm going to keep that tradition going. But if those books are ever taken out of libraries, if museums are ever destroyed, you will see historians on the front lines of those struggles. But for commemoration being about who we strive to be for the future, I think the Confederates are going to become increasingly a difficult choice a difficult circle to square, if you will. And I'm also glad that I'm not alone in this. In many ways, we can talk a bit more, but the lost cause, veneration of the Confederacy, happened in the 20th century. Frederick Douglass was, at the end of his life, he didn't know that. He died very suddenly. He thought he was going to live for a very long time yet to come and keep working. But he gave a speech in 1894, and he's talking about memory and history, forgetting, remembering. And he says, "But whatever else I may forget, I shall never forget the difference between those who fought for liberty and those who fought for slavery, between those who fought to save the Republic and those who fought to destroy it." And so, as a Civil War historian, I think ultimately it's partly my duty and privilege to help remember Douglass's words and make sure that we implement them in the future. Thank you.
Can y'all hear me, or would you like me to use the microphone, which is not on? Recording? So, is the mic on now? Okay, it's kind of on. All right. Thank you all to my students for being here. Senior theses are due today.
Oh, wow.
And this is a senior thesis class. So I just want to say thank you for being here. I hope that this is a rewarding experience for you. Thank you, Connor, for what you said. I was writing furiously with your definition of commemoration. I actually just want to get the copy of that text. Connor got in touch with me about 2 months ago, out of the blue, and I was like, who is this guy? What's this all about? But the thing that really got my attention was honestly his writing. And I'm saying this to students here and really to anyone, how to put these very complex ideas and these very contentious ideas into words, it really did get my attention. And I actually want to read something that he just included in an email to give a kind of example of this. He concluded one of these early emails to me: "While I work for the Naming Commission and absolutely endorse our decisions, I also think that any decision on renaming should involve a lot of deep thought. The duty to remember the past as it existed and not to erase the difficult parts of our history is a powerful one, but so also is the duty to have our commemorations reflect the highest aspirations that we hold for the future," relates to something he just concluded with, "and not some of the most traumatic acts we have in our past. So I welcome all sorts of viewpoints on this work, and when differences of opinion have come up in past talks, I'm interested in asking you about that. I have done, past talks I have done, it is a pleasure to discuss them in the best traditions of scholarly discourse." That's what I want this to be today. In the best traditions of scholarly discourse, navigating some of these difficulties that we have between communities in the present, between the past and the present. These are the types of conversations that I'm very proud universities are having and that Connor is a part of in the world of public policy, making a real difference in the so-called real world with these names and the difficult conversations that have to take place as these names are reconsidered. So I just wanted to praise Connor for his writing.
Thank you.
Say that this is an important skill for all of us to put complex ideas into meaningful words. But to start this conversation part of it, just want to ask Connor, what was your original interest in the Civil War? What got you motivated to enter into this field?
Yeah, no, thank you. It happened to me in college, actually, in undergrad. I was able to take a course on Civil War memory, and at the same time, I was speaking to my grandfather, who was a veteran of World War II, and he was born in 1913. And I used to always ask him, as a historian from a very early age, what do you remember of the past? And I was really disappointed he didn't remember World War I, which is such a teenager thing to do. Like, how dare you not remember something that happened when you were 5 in 1918? But he one day kind of got fed up, and he said, I was born in 1913. I said, yeah, of course. He said, when I was your age, I knew Civil War veterans, and I knew formerly enslaved people. They were my neighbors. They came to the events at my high school. They were all around me. And he lived to see Barack Obama elected president. And that lifespan of knowing enslaved people, formerly enslaved people, and then seeing an African American elected to the presidency reminds us how truly recent the Civil War is in our memory and in our history. It is still possible to get away from me. If you know anybody who was born in 1930, or knew anybody who was born in 1930, it's still very possible to shake the hand of somebody who shook the hand of a formerly enslaved person, or a United States veteran, or a Confederate veteran. And so it is 160 years in our past, but it's also in some ways one handshake away. I think that's a really important way to think about it. For me at least, ever since I got that sense of the past, I've been studying it more or less nonstop.
Regarding the 9 bases that had Confederate names, why were they named after Confederates in the first place? And I'm actually also curious to know, I think an important addition to that question is what year were they named after Confederates?
Yeah, it's one of the things I was slightly surprised to find. I knew they had been named mostly in World War I, World War II, and I learned they were entirely named in World War I, World War II, partly because you needed to mobilize 5 million and then 16 million Americans very quickly for war. And when these bases were being built, they needed 3 things essentially. They needed land you could train on all year round, because you don't want a blizzard to shut down training. You need lots of available land, just land that's not developed already. And you need railroad junctions nearby to ship all the men and troops there. And that essentially was, the South was a prime candidate for that. You also have Woodrow Wilson's government and FDR's government, which had a lot of Southern Democrats in it. So there's a lot of political influence happening there too. The main thing is that these bases were put up very quickly, and the only 2 criteria the Army had was that the name would not be inoffensive to people in the vicinity of the post. That was their language, which they interpreted in 1914 to 1918 and 1941, 1945 as white people. In fact, Fort Benning got named literally because the Army went to the UDC, United Daughters of the Confederacy, and they said, who's a good name for a post? And the United Daughters of the Confederacy said, Henry Benning. The other thing, which is so very Army, is they wanted very short names, because they have to like spray paint this on a bunch of crates of ammunition and things. So they said, we want Bragg, Lee, Hood, short names that aren't going to be confused for anything. So that's how it was named. It was literally the naming was done. I've seen the papers. There's a commanding officer, and he has a subordinate. He says, please give me 3 choices. And they say, here they are, 1, 2, 3. And he chooses, I want that one. So the sense that they were named in like a great national reconciliation, or that a lot of people talked about these names, really isn't the case. They happened very quickly.
So I just want to follow up on that.
Yeah.
So they happen for this very pragmatic reason to honor a local hero. Is that a safe way of putting it? And so United Daughters of the Confederacy, here's our guy, here's our hero.
Yeah.
It was not, I was actually curious if it was to make sure that white Southerners felt included in this armed service as they're about to go out and fight a foreign enemy, that, hey, we're all in this together, and we might have had our differences in the 19th century and slaughtered each other, but now we're all on the same team. It did not have that. What you're saying is it did not have that motivation behind it.
Not from the paper trail I can tell. I mean, the not inoffensive part, and I'll say for the Naming Commission, we had a website that took submissions. Our number 1 recommendation for any new name in the South was Fort Sherman, after William T. Sherman. And so for a number of reasons, that was not entertained back then, and we didn't entertain it also, in large part because of what William T. Sherman did after the Civil War in his Native American campaigns. But there was not, we could find that much of a true bring everybody back together. I mean, there are other moments, the Spanish-American War, reunions at Gettysburg, which are almost entirely all white affairs, where there is that kind of binding the nation's wounds, but it was not a big overt place. I would just say that people, of course, liked that there was a Fort Lee near Richmond and a Fort Hood in Texas. And, yeah.
Well, that's very interesting. I thought that it might have that kind of, let's get all unified because we all have to go fight now. What considerations drove the Commission's decisions to name these forts or rename these forts after the people that you did choose?
Yeah, the commissioners, and we published all our reports. We've been archived, so unlike Hillary Clinton, you can read my emails. But they essentially, very early on, they settled on 5 recommendations. First, that the person should have exceptional service or valor, just truly be grounded in phenomenal military acumen, because they are Army posts. They wanted them to have a connection to the locality of the post, have some kind of regional connection, have a connection to the service of the post, because these posts do different things for our military. And ideally, they would be a deceased person. And the last one was that they wanted their final list of candidates, the aggregate list, to represent the armed services in its current composition, if that makes sense. So what that really meant and looked like is you learn in the military the whole Army-Navy thing is real, and Navy people complain the Army slides have too much text on them, so this is very much an Army slide. But what we did essentially is we had these at the top, these 6 streams of recommendations to us from elected officials, from officers, from enlisted soldiers, from Army civilians, from civilians off-post local communities. We got letters from people, handwritten letters, which were incredibly touching to read. And then we also had a website where anybody could submit a submission. And those are pretty thoughtful. We got a few wags who, some person said Fort Will and Kate because they'd win any charm offensive, referring to the Duke and Duchess of, or Prince and Princess of Wales now, I guess. So that was a large part of our information. What we did then is we got all those names together. We use a slight algorithm, only not to count how many votes they got, but how many different people recommended them. So one good idea for a new name, if a senator and a officer and an enlisted soldier and the NAACP and LULAC and somebody living off post and somebody living on post and somebody living in Chicago who did a website submission, if all those people recommended them, that was a name that a lot of Americans were interested in. And so from that, we had got these together. I led a team of historians as we researched these and really hashed it out over many days in conference rooms during COVID too. So we had like masks and we were like approaching the table and putting one name and going back. In any case, and that got to 87 finalists. And those 87 finalists, the commissioners looked and debated about. They took some names on, put other names off, and eventually that got to the namesakes that we settled on.
Just so y'all know, we are going to go until 1:15 approximately. It's 10 till 1 now. This part will go on for about another 10 minutes, and then we'll have the last 15 minutes to open it up for questions, so you know kind of where we are and that you'll have an opportunity to ask your own questions. What I took notes on at the end of your presentation there was your definition of commemoration, and the only words I was able to get down were communal esteem and honor, and that celebrating a figure kind of in a commemoration, whether it's a statue or naming a building or a facility after them, is really more about the future than it is about the past. So my question is there, this is to kind of zoom out and get the 30,000 foot view of this, is there a theory of commemoration? Like, and this is trans-historical, it goes back to, honestly, Egyptians building monuments to themselves so that they can be remembered long after their death, or a community building something and naming it after somebody, a likeness or simply a name. And sorry, this will be a little bit of, I'll have to do a little bit of explaining here, but I will get to the question for you. So I'm working with a student now, we're working on Nazi Germany and how Germans today remember their past. I'm from Birmingham, Alabama, and I thought about, there's actually a statue in Birmingham, not just of the 4 girls who were killed in the 16th Street Baptist Church bombing. There's actually a statue also of a police officer in this militant pose, holding a German Shepherd attack dog, which is to commemorate the police brutality and violence against the civil rights demonstrators. Clearly, the 4 little girls is to remember them. Yeah. The statue of the police officer is to remember him but not honor him, in the same way that they're not going to be tearing down concentration camps to just, hey, let's forget that this happened. So there is a purpose within commemoration to remember the things that we've done wrong. Yeah. So I'm happy to see these names go, and that we should keep a Fort Lee just to remember a man who fought for slavery and fought to dissolve the Union. But just, I'm thinking about statues of Saddam Hussein. Some statues have the purpose of, let's remember someone we like, or let's remember an episode or an individual that we very much don't like and want to get away from. But there's also a purpose in commemoration of intimidation. Like, okay, I'm the ruler of this country now. I'm going to dot the landscape with a bunch of images of myself to let people know who's in charge. And if you go against me, there's going to be some kind of repercussions for that. So just, is there any kind of overall theory for why people construct these things in the first place?
Yeah. There are lots of places to go with that. And just for the Saddam Hussein point, that there's a small group that's opposed to our work, and they're using the democratic processes to do so, and that's great. That's what our democracy is about. But one of their taglines is Americans put up statues, you don't take them down. And I was kind of thinking, like, well, in the second Iraq War, we took some statues down. But to that point, I think that a broad commemoration is definition, purpose, theory, is it's the use of public space and in some ways public memory as enshrined by government processes to make a political statement about the past. That's what commemoration is. It's always been political, I think, as you point out. I've used Percy Shelley's sonnet Ozymandias, which, if you know about it, is all about this crumbling statue in Egypt. And they literally found a Ramses statue in an Egyptian sewer a few years ago. They were digging a new drainage ditch, and they literally found a crumbling Ozymandias statue, so it truly still exists. But that's my take on commemoration, is that unlike memory, which is individual, and we all need our own memories, commemoration is about a political use of public space to make a statement about the past. And that's often done through statuary. It can be done through other ideas as well. Yep.
So that question was kind of generally about why are they constructed in the first place. Yeah. So in tearing them down, again, kind of a general or theoretical question, was there any kind of rubric that was established for, should this one stay, should this one go? You were a part of an official commission working with the armed services, but societally we're having this debate. I'm very interested in this. In the wake of Black Lives Matter, a lot of statues came down, a lot of figures were questioned. Some stayed, some ended up in the bottom of a river. Some of those decisions I'm completely on board with. Some of them like, yeah, okay, maybe we shouldn't. Maybe we should think a little bit more carefully about this one. So I do it a little bit on a case-by-case basis. I'm kind of interested in, is there some kind of template that we can establish through societal conversation to then, all right, simply apply to a given statue or a given name, or is that too federal? Yeah. Is that too kind of uniform, and it really should be done on a case-by-case basis based on local values and local who people locally consider heroes and villains? Yeah.
I'll leave the Naming Commission a little bit for the answer, because the Naming Commission had a mandate. If it commemorates, it must go. And so that was
it commemorates the Confederacy.
Confederacy, yeah. But in other places that don't have that mandate, and I mean, our national parks, if you go to a Civil War battlefield, they have all kinds of commemorations that many would find problematic today. And our society writ large. I was actually a young grad student at Yale when Calhoun College came up, because John Calhoun, before he was the architect of secession, he was the Yale class of 1804, and they named one of their first residential colleges after John C. Calhoun, because in 1932 that was a perfect thing to do. And they even had stained glass windows showing enslaved people working in a cotton field as part of the college. And colleges, by the way, they're dorms at Yale. They're really fancy dorms, essentially, is the best way of thinking of them. And what they eventually came up with, which I really endorse, is when you're thinking about renaming, there are two major things. First is, what is the principal legacy of the individual you're talking about? And that's where I think principal legacy, you have to define who gets to decide the principal legacy. It's some kind of a social consensus. But the principal legacy of John C. Calhoun is not, like some people said, that he was the Secretary of War in 1814. The principal legacy is that he was the architect of secession. The principal legacy of Robert E. Lee is not that he was superintendent of West Point, or that he even liberated Harper's Ferry from John Brown's raid. The principal legacy of Robert E. Lee is that he was the Confederacy's greatest general and national hero. And so once you've decided the principal legacy, the other part that I think is important is to go back to when the statue was put up and said, was there a real robust discussion about this involving a lot of people from different viewpoints? If that happened, then that might actually be a really good reason to not remove it. What we see in a lot of these statues is that African Americans were completely taken out of the conversation, not invited, and that's how you get this idea of Robert E. Lee. So that's, I think, the two major things. And there's a third you can think about in an institutional setting, which is this person's contribution truly so great to the institution that's commemorating him or her that you need to overlook or need to negotiate that with some issues. Not to use the Yale example, but Elihu Yale, first of all, never actually came to America, but he gave the money that started Yale University. It exists because he is there. So some people said to change the name of Yale, but some have said, well, he's the person who started this, and Yale exists today in some ways as more of a symbol than actually a testament to a 16th century, or 18th, 17th, 18th century British noble. So, did I just, sorry.
I just have one last question, then I want to open it up. We mentioned in an email exchange, so he goes to a lot of these public places as they're debating whether or not to change the name, and you mentioned in one email getting screamed at by neo-Confederates. I'm just wondering if you could share an example of when teaching history becomes, pretty visceral or pretty on pins and needles.
Yeah. Now, I think that, and this goes back to, again, memory and the negotiator memory, I think our democracy is strong enough that people can have their own personal memories of the past 99% of the time, and it's okay. But what there's tension is when people think that society, as an aggregate of different viewpoints, has to reflect their own memory. And for a long time, if you use my Confederate population example, American society has been way over commemorating the actions of 1 out of 6 Americans which were actually committed against the United States government. Again, Andrew Johnson pardons all the Confederates for treason in 1868, which is acknowledging that they committed treason. But we all have things we take our identity from, and I think if you have hinged your identity, another French philosopher essentially said that if you haven't lived through something, if you're remembering something that's outside your life cycle, then how you remember it's more about you than it is about what actually happened in the past. And so a lot of individuals have put lots of things on the Confederacy that they didn't really do, but they see Confederates as icons of small government, even though the Confederacy was the most intrusive state in American history, of states' rights, even though it was founded on enslavement and it's in their entire documents. But when you lose that, you feel very visceral reaction because it's part of your identity. People will often say, my great-grandfather was in the 4th Virginia, or my great-great-grandfather was in the 4th Virginia, and he was an honorable man. That may be the case, but you also have 7 other great-great-grandfathers to choose from, and 8 great-great-grandmothers. And if you want to chart yourself in the past, maybe explore some of the things they did. The last thing I do want to be very clear about, though, and then I want to hear questions, and I'm happy to stay for as long as afterwards, is I'm a millennial, and all the problems of the world used to be my fault, and now they're Gen Z's fault, so that's your fault, so that's how time works. But I have no desire to take a time machine back to 1864 and find some Confederate soldier who's 20 and signed up when he was 17 because his family made him, and 1 year into the war, he had his draft extended for the course of the war, because that's what the Confederates did. Again, most intrusive government. They said, 1862, you're in the war for life. You're going to either achieve independence or die, or survive till you surrender. That wasn't really an option back then. I don't want to find him outside Petersburg and he's starving and he's got 800 calories a day and no shoes and he's suffering from typhus. And I don't want to like kick dirt on him or say, how dare you have done this? And if I do that, I'm taking his humanity away. And that's something that people did to enslave people in this country. And I don't want to be any part of that project. But I do want to say that the political cause that put him there is something that should not be commemorated. And there are ways to commemorate Confederate suffering, I think, that should happen. But it's not a giant, glorious statue of Robert E. Lee. So.
All right, time for questions. And
So we'll be taking questions from the audience. So we have one here and then one here.
Thank you so much. It was really interesting to see the process of how you guys in the commission really worked like day and night to rename these forts and military posts. But what keeps catching my eye is Fort Liberty. Yeah. What is the story behind that? Because it's not named after a person or people.
Yeah, it goes back in many ways to the arrows on the previous slide and those different data streams. But for Fort Bragg, which is the nation's premier power projection platform, which essentially means you can be a soldier and you wake up in Fort Bragg and something happens somewhere around the world and in an hour you're activated and you're going to sleep, into Crete or wherever it is. They have always seen themselves as kind of the center of the military universe. And whether that's true or not is something for us to decide, or for all to decide individually. But their community was very, very clear that because they have this separate tradition, there's the 82nd Airborne and Special Forces, that anybody who commemorate on one side will not be appropriate for the other side. And I think also Fort Bragg, more than any of those other men really, Braxton Bragg himself is just he was literally insufferable. His men in the Mexican-American War tried to frag him. They threw a canister shell under his cot. And he got reprimanded by everybody for being just an insufferable, irascible person. And also a poor general. He lost a lot of battles. But I think Fort Bragg, more than anywhere else, they really did do that cognitive dissonance where they thought that Bragg means something different than the person. So when they were going to lose that, there's a brief moment, so I'll try to be quick, but where they found he had a cousin named Edwin Bragg who fought for the United States and was also the ambassador to Hong Kong in 1888. And they said, we should name him after this great American. He fought, and he was ambassador to Hong Kong. And I said, man, never has Benjamin Harrison's foreign policy gotten so much love as it has right now. But the point of this all is that they were very resistant to losing the name Bragg, I think more than others. And they rallied around liberty. And we heard it in our engagements when we went back to them. Everybody from every part of the community, from officers to enlisted to retirement, said, liberty is really our name. And some of the worst things in our nation's history have been done in liberty, not to go back to John C. Calhoun, but in 1832, Andrew Jackson, the first secession crisis, maybe second after the Harvard Convention, but he raised the toast. He says, the Union, it must be preserved. And John Calhoun stands and says, the Union next to our liberty most dear. So liberty's been used for a lot of bad things in our nation's history. At the same time, our greatest wars, the Revolutionary War, the Civil War, World War II, you've seen the greatest number of citizen soldiers signing up to essentially expand liberty one way or another. And liberty means something. It's why people still want to move to the United States and still want to live here. And I think that liberty is a value that can be used to remember both our nation's greatest achievements and greatest problems. So, thanks. Yeah.
Well, first of all, thank you for speaking to us. I have a question about some of the statues as part of the Statuary Hall collection in DC. So one is Jefferson Davis. So I'm just curious your thoughts on how that is still there while the Senate, wanted to get rid of the commemoration of other Confederate leaders. And the other is I just kind of want to hear your thoughts on the commemoration of Andrew Jackson with his statues in the Capitol.
Yeah. So Jefferson Davis, I mean, the Statuary Hall, every state has 2 statues they get to put in, and that state legislature decides that, I believe. And so Mississippi state legislature continues to think that Jefferson Davis is somebody they want to send to D.C., and there's not really any way to get around that. I should note that Virginia recalled Robert E. Lee a few years ago, and his statue is now actually in the Virginia Museum of History and Culture. It's an incredible display. It used to be called Battle Abbey, and there were these massive portraits on all four walls of the Confederacy and all of its seasons. But now you walk in, and when you walk in, there's this giant panel. It's like a wall that says the lost cause on it, and it tells you what the lost cause was and why these portraits are kind of false. And you have to negotiate that before you can see anything else. And now Robert E. Lee's statue is actually behind that wall, kind of like in its shadow. And so I think it's a cool way to think about this. I mean, I think Jefferson Davis himself would be pretty surprised to find his statue in the United States Capitol. If you read his writings, he was pretty clear that he was president of an independent nation, and that he was the most ardent Confederate nationalist. Even when the war is truly going horribly in 1864, he's still saying, no, independence is the only thing we possibly will settle on. Andrew Jackson, I think that might go to my idea of principal legacies. And his principal legacy is really conflicted because he had so many principal legacies. But there is a wonderful, huge book called The Age of Jacksonian Democracy, which essentially posits that although it was limited to white men, which is really problematic for lots of reasons, Jackson and his age expanded the democratic impulse as we understand it today, that common people should have a say in government, and made that a national phenomenon. And that is important, I think. And so that, I think, is where you have these difficult discussions. I would personally actually didn't ask me what I'd personally do, so I'll take more questions, but happy to talk more, yeah.
Yes, thank you so much for being here, sir. I was just curious, you were talking about some of the standards that you commonly use when you're evaluating whether or not a memorial should remain up. And when you look at Abraham Lincoln with the Lincoln Memorial, for example, I think there's, particularly in recent years, there's been a lot of scholarly interest in how he suspended habeas corpus for a huge swath of Eastern Maryland. He would commonly use that to jail without due process his political opponents or people he suspected of being political opponents. And I've also recently started to read about a number of military executions he actually ordered of American Indians who resisted U.S. encroachments into their ancestral homelands. And so wouldn't it be logical to say that based on some wartime atrocities like that, it might not be appropriate, particularly to people whose ancestors suffered at the hands of that, to commemorate Abraham Lincoln?
I think it would certainly be logical to say that, and people are more than welcome to say that. And I would encourage folks who feel that way to try to use the democratic processes available to them to start that movement. My response as a historian would be that, again, we're talking about principal legacies in a war that has 750,000 deaths and is fought because there are states who are making war against the United States. There are going to be casualties. Habeas corpus, sadly, is the first thing that goes in virtually any war, and it essentially goes in World War I, there's essentially World War II. Jefferson Davis also suspends habeas corpus. So, again, to me, the principal legacy of Abraham Lincoln remains someone who not only brought about the emancipation of 4 million enslaved people throughout his action, but also evolved his thinking throughout his lifetime, and was someone who actually said, I said these things in 1840, 1850, I regret them now, I've changed. And actually his last speech he gives is actually about voting rights for African Americans, which were not guaranteed at that time, far from it. But he says, I believe that not only highly intelligent African Americans, a little problematic, but also any soldier who served 200,000 men, that's a lot of people he's saying, should be allowed to vote. And that's a arc of change that is important to note, I think, for Lincoln. So I'm still on Abe's side, but.
And hello, that slide you had about January 6th, I just wanted to ask about that really quickly, because obviously that's in the middle of all of this. And seeing like Confederate flags inside of our nation's capital and seeing a group of people, have an insurrection or armed insurrection against the United States government while all of this is happening. Did that kind of change the rhetoric in DC or in your commission or anything like that? Like I could imagine that kind of gripped, the narrative.
Yeah, and there's Eric Foner is one of the true titans of 19th century history, and he actually, just my whole handshake thing, he met W.E. Du Bois when he was a young boy and Du Bois was old, so like this handshake thing is real. But he frequently says that the issues of the present teach us the questions to ask of the past, and we always view the past through our own present. So certainly the idea of an insurrection, a word many people use, that happened, gave this some new meaning. I think also in other ways, the post-Cold War era has given this new meaning too. One thing I think about a lot, and I need to be absolutely clear, especially because this is being recorded, that I am not in any way, shape, or form comparing the Confederate States of America to ISIS. But when you think about a nation, people always say we had two nations. What does a nation do? Normally it signs treaties. It has a currency that has a value that can be traded. It protects its borders. It has the consent or has support of people. The Confederacy did very few of those things. But before there was this thing that says we control this land and we say we're a nation, we didn't have a way of thinking about the Confederacy like that, because in the Cold War mindset, there were nation states. That was who's on our side, who's on their side. And so I think that in that sense, many developments, the war in Ukraine has made us rethink kind of infantry, why infantry still matters. For a long time, we thought it was all tanks and missiles, and now we realize that it still actually matters what guys in boots on the ground do. All those together, I think, reshape how you conceive of the past and the questions you ask of it. And one quick example, but there's a guy in 1940 who gives a speech about the Civil War calling it the blundering generation. His name is James D. Randall. He's actually the president of the OAH, Organization of American Historians. He's giving it as the presidential address, and people are standing up and cheering. And what he's saying is the Civil Wars need the slaughter, that nothing good came out of it. And he's telling that exactly because he's just been through World War I, sees World War II happening. And so we view the past through the politics of our present, I think, always. The historian's job is to not let those politics get too much into his interpretation and show where the facts go.
So that sort of raises the question of when is the optimal time to commemorate our wars, our heroes. I mean, if I remember correctly, Karen Cox makes this argument that, the United Daughters of the Confederacy and others were sort of seeking a way to grieve their lost brothers and husbands and fathers, and it was sort of out of this that comes this monument, or the lost cause ideology, really. That seems too soon when people are still grieving. On the other hand, the World War I monument in DC is still under construction. And there's always a political moment that is going to color the past. So do we need a succession of monuments to sort of reflect where we are?
That's a great question. I mean, and in a way, you didn't ask this, but I'll broaden it a little bit to people saying, well, if we change these, is that a slippery slope to those? And my short answer is, if 87 senators tell us to change it, then we should change it. That represents a pretty broad swath of the American public through representative systems. But to your more precise question, I think that our commemorative landscape, and again, you will find very problematic things in Ulysses Grant's life and Lincoln's life. I am not in favor of the memorial coming down or of the Grant statue in Congress, which you don't talk about that much, but if you ever go to U.S. Congress, Capitol Hill, Grant's right there in front of Congress. He's leading the forces kind of protecting the Capitol, and it's a beautiful monument, I think. I think we can be broad enough in our society to have many monuments, and I think one thing we can consider is ways to memorialize or commemorate broad swaths of people without focusing on one person who will forever be an imperfect choice to others. I also think that what's been floated, and did not happen in this case, but could happen in some, is expanding monumental areas. So if this generation thought this monument was good, that's great. Leave them there, but then put up a new generation. So there's a statue called Rumors of War that was made. It's now in Virginia, but it's of an African American USCT man, and he's imitating the Jeb Stuart cavalry pose. And so that's kind of an update. If you want to commemorate Robert E. Lee in some way, Powhatan Beatty is an African American man born enslaved in Virginia and Richmond, escapes to freedom, joins the USCT, comes back as a soldier to Richmond. He's fighting in New Market Heights at the end of the siege of Petersburg to kind of encircle the Confederates. His unit's decimated. He leads the last 17 men on the last charge that captures the position and kind of seals the siege of Petersburg. That's a Virginia story. He's a Virginian. So commemorate him and Lee and have people think, okay, you know, this is all Virginia history. It's all there. That would be a way, I think, in a museum setting or something to tell the story fully. So. Yes, yeah. And we did make one base hyphenated between two people, and that's something the military does a lot with joint bases now. And so for the immediate military, I would recommend they think about hyphenating other bases, especially if Kit Carson, who was a, quote, Indian fighter, continues to be a name that we have questions about. You could add on another name that makes us think about that history differently.
We're at 1:15 now. I could stay here for another hour, but I don't want to impose that on you. So let's give a nice round of applause for
Thank you.